Okay, welcome back everyone to the land of the living, to the land of virtual reality, where everything is possible. Right now, we are going to get into um, the biology section. This is the last learning module, and then we're going to get into the discussion sections after this. Okay, so we've got one of these to go through, and then we will start the discussions probably sometime next week, but I'll keep you abreast of that. Okay, like I said, this is the biology section, and biology is essentially concerned with what is biology? Biology is essentially the scientific study of life. Oops. Okay. Scientific study of life. Um, and I guess when you define biology in such a way, it begs the question immediately, well, what is life, right? What is life? What is life? This is a big question within biology itself. How do we define life? How do we say what is alive and what isn't alive? Okay. Turns out that if you really think about this, it kind of makes sense. But it turns out that life is very difficult to define. Right? I mean, living things are so diverse that we can say that plants are alive, you and I are alive, a bacteria is alive, but defining alive versus not is surprisingly difficult. So we can say things like, for example, we are alive, plants are alive, animals are alive, right? We'll just call these equals alive. All of these things equal alive, right? Bacteria, etc., fungi, all of those things are alive. However, how do we distinguish between alive or not alive? That's the big question here, and it's pretty difficult. Why is it so difficult to answer this question? Um, because I guess the simplest way to say this is that we are not just a sum of our parts. Okay, we're not just a sum of our parts. So we can't just say that all of these things have these specific parts and therefore they are alive, because there's more to the story than this. There's more to the story. Okay, and this can be, I guess, best explained by something called an emergent property. And an emergent property is something that's not present in any of the system's components. Okay, so not present not present in any of the system's components. Okay, so this means that once you put everything together in the system, once you put all of the parts together, you gain a new emergent property from having all of these parts together that's not present in any of the system components individually. Okay, okay, so this idea of an emergent property. Okay, and it turns out that oops, a complex property, which includes this idea of life. Okay, um, they emerge. They emerge from the interactions of much more simple parts. For example, you and I and we, let's just call this the glorious we are composed of trillions upon trillions of tiny little molecules, like we learned in the last section. Different types of molecules make up us as humans. Okay, we are just a series of chemical reactions that are happening within our body. Okay? But do the chemical reactions define life? Are the chemicals themselves alive? No, they're not. We are somehow alive. And this complex emergent property, this life, is coming out of a collection of systems that don't have that property. Okay, none of these molecules that make up our bodies have any sort of life to them. They're simply molecules. Okay, so this is this idea of an emergent property, something like a complex property, something like life coming out of or emerging from the interactions of much more simple parts. Okay, so because of this, we want to have some sort of organizational pattern for life. Okay, so we want to be able to compartmentalize these things and define them a little bit more rationally, especially life. We want to be able to define life. Okay, so let's come up with an organizational principle or an organization pattern. Okay. First and foremost, all matter starts with the atom. Okay. This is the fundamental unit of all substances. Okay. And these things don't have to be alive. An atom is the fundamental unit of a rock. An atom is the fundamental unit of your pencil. An atom is the fundamental unit of any substance in the world, whether it's alive or dead. Okay? So starting with the atom, we build from the atom, and we can form a molecule. Okay? Molecules, just like we learned in the last section, are atoms that are bound together. Okay? So this is the second level of life organization. Okay. From here, we can go further. Oh, maybe we should do some examples here. So, for example, we have an oxygen atom, and for example, we have a water molecule. Okay. All right. Next, after molecule, we form what's called a cell. Okay? A cell is made up of molecules. Okay? And finally, we're getting into things that are alive. Okay? The cell is the smallest unit of life. There are things that are multi-celled. Oops. These are called multi-celled organisms. Okay? And these are composed of many cells. And there are something called single-celled organisms. And as the name implies, they are composed of single cells. Okay. For example, here, plants, animals, us, we are multi-celled organisms. Things that are single-celled organisms are things called protists, amoebas, You guys have heard of amoebas. Okay, they're just little tiny animals that are composed of only a single cell. Okay. Now, the next organizational level is something called tissue. Okay. Tissue is simply an organized array of cells. Okay. Organized array of cells. I guess we should also throw in some other substances because it's not just cells that make up the tissue. Sometimes it's other substances. So an organized array of cells and substances that interact in a collective task. Well, maybe we should do it like this. Okay, so that's a tissue. And then going from a tissue, the next organizational level is an organ. An organ is a structural unit of interacting tissue. And you can see how we're going here. Each of these levels is building on the last level. Okay, so we started with an atom. We're all the way up to an organ now. The next organizational system is called an organ system. Okay, an organ system is an interacting set of organs. Okay. Next, oh, that was 6. Sorry. Okay. Next, number 7, we finally make it to an organism. An organism is a collection of organ systems. This can include both multi-celled and single-celled organisms. In the case of a single-celled organism, the organs, the collection of organ systems are all contained within a single cell. Okay, so that's an organism. Next, we have systems of organisms living together. So this is called a population. Okay, the population is simply a group of organisms. A group of organisms of the same species. I guess we should clarify that. Oops. Of the same species, living in same geographical area. Next, we have more levels still. It keeps going. Don't worry. Next, we have a community. Okay, and a community is all the populations of all species in a specified area. Okay, so it's all populations of all species in a spatial area. Okay. So in one geographical area, all of the different species living together in that one area. Okay. Next, keeps going. we have an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community, so the stuff that's up here. Community interacting with interacting with its physical environment. Okay, so it's interacting with the physical environment through energy transfer. So through energy transfer and materials. Okay. So the community is getting energy and giving energy back into the ecosystem, and the ecosystem is providing energy and materials back into the communities. Okay. Next, and finally, we have the biosphere. Okay. The biosphere is the sum of all ecosystems within a planet. So sum of all ecosystems within a planet. Okay? So this is the organizational system for life. We started all the way down at an atom, the smallest, the most fundamental unit of all substances, and we slowly worked our way up, building different components of life, all the way up to the entire planet. So at the end, we are including the entire planet. Okay? So now that we've laid out the organizational principles of life, maybe we can begin to differentiate between life and non-life. Okay, so the question is, how does life, quote, differ from non-life? Okay, this is the question. Let's start out with some observations from what we just laid out, this organizational principle. Okay, so first, all matter, no matter what it is, living or not, is composed of atoms. Okay? And these atoms combine into molecules. Okay? That's the first point. Second point here is that the unique properties of life, the unique these unique complex properties of life start to emerge as certain kinds of molecules become organized into cells. Okay. And then the last thing that I want to note, or last observation, is that higher levels of life. Let's start talking about higher levels of life. Higher levels of life come from these emergent properties that come out of this, many simple things added together. Okay, so these higher levels of life come from this. We have multi-celled organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and biospheres. Okay? These are the higher levels of life. And they all come from these emergent properties that we talked about that are basically dependent on these little pieces coming together to form life. Okay? So before we have life, we just have atoms and molecules, and then life is defined as essentially these lifeless molecules acting together in a coherent way, or coherent and rational way, to become organized into cells, or to become organized into organisms. Okay. So this is how you can differentiate between life and non-life. Are the atoms and molecules combined in such a way that they produce a cell or an organism? Okay? So this is how we're going to differentiate between life and non-life. And of course, this is a very simplified understanding of this, but I think that it makes sense on the level that we're working with. Okay, let's go back because I threw out a bunch of terms, and I didn't really define them in a nice way. Okay, so let's go back and define something, or define all these terms that I brought up, but just kind of glossed over. Okay, so first, we want to talk a little bit more about an organism. Okay, this is what we have that's living. This is what we've just determined is alive. So we want to know exactly what this is in terms of its biology. First and foremost, an organism requires energy and nutrients. Okay? Energy and nutrients. Energy is the ability to do work. And nutrients are needed for growth and survival. Okay? But critically, they can't be made by the organism. Okay? So a nutrient is anything that can't be made by the organism, that must be taken from the environment that it's in. Okay? In this regard, there are a few different ways of classifying organisms based on these two bits of things that they need. The first is called a producer. Okay? A producer makes their own food. Okay? They make their own food using energy and simple raw materials. Oof, that's a really bad arrow. Maybe do that. There we go. Okay, for example, plants. Plants are producers. They use sunlight and this is the energy. They use sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and other nutrients to produce simple sugars. Okay? And this becomes the plant's food. Okay? In contrast to a producer, there's something called a consumer. Okay? A consumer cannot make their own food. Okay? And since they can't make their own food, they must feed on other organisms. Okay? And they have to feed on the other organisms for both energy and nutrients. Okay. A really good example of this are animals. Of which we are a part. Okay? So we must consume other animals or other organisms in order to get the energy and the nutrients that we need, because we can't absorb them from our environment using something like photosynthesis, and we can't produce our own food within our own bodies. We actually have to consume it and allow our bodies to break down the other organisms in order to take those energy and nutrients from the other organisms. Okay? Now there is a cycle, there is a nutrient cycle between the producers and the consumers, okay? So there's a nutrient cycle. Between the producers and the consumers. So you have the producers and the consumers. The consumers eat the producers. Well, maybe we should do the arrow the other way. So the producers pull nutrients out of the soil or out of the environment. The consumers eat the producers and other consumers, and the consumers release the nutrients back into the environment, which are then cycled to the producers, which take up the nutrients, and then the consumers eat them again. Okay, so there's a nutrient cycle that happens between producers and consumers. Okay, so I think that we will stop there for today. We've made it pretty far in the notes, and I think I'm able to move quite a bit faster than I am in the lecture hall. So I don't want to give you guys too much information, like an information overload. So for today, this will be the only lecture, and we will pick up again with this biology on Thursday. All right. So see you guys then. If you have any questions, let me know. You can shoot me an email. You can talk to me on Google Hangouts, however you want to talk to me. The information on how to get a hold of me is in that first announcement that I sent out. Other than that, I hope you guys are doing great, and take care. I'll see you next time.